Dream machine. DICOM, H07, I-18 in the snap. We're building the future, never looking back.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Imaging Informatics Unplugged. I'm Jason Nagels, and today's guest goes back with me almost to the start of my career. Norman Young and I first crossed paths way back in 2003 at a company called eFilm, one of the earliest free PACS viewers, where we were working with the University Health Network in Toronto, Ontario. In 2005, Norman founded ClearCanvas, an open source medical imaging platform built from scratch that's still used by clinicians around the world. And in 2021, the ACR recognized his work with their Global Humanitarian Award. Now, that career spans 25 years in healthcare software, but it started with a deeply personal turn. Norm was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma as a third-year engineering student, which set him on a path of using engineering to give back to medicine. Today, he's building something new, CareChorus, a nonprofit aimed at helping patients and caregivers make sense of their own care. I've personally used this app myself. We're joined by co-host Mohanad Hussain from Simcast, which this episode will be simulcast on. And we get into why Norman chose open source over a closed commercial product. We talk about what it was like watching download counts climb from every corner of the world, including, oddly enough, Antarctica. We discuss how AI coding tools like Claude Code are changing the way a small team can build tools. Now, if any of this gets you thinking about your own career path, check out nagelsconsulting.com. We have an imaging informatics primer course. We have courses to help you take the CIIP exam, and we have our all-new hands-on DICOM learning lab included with a lesson at nagelsconsulting.com. So with all that said, let's get into the episode. Well, thank you very much, Norm, for joining us today. And really excited about this conversation. And I wanted to maybe start out, I got to cross paths with you back in 2003 when I was just starting out in my imaging career. We were at eFilm way back in the day on University Avenue in Toronto. I'd love to hear about your start into imaging informatics and the journey that led to you where you are today.
Thanks so much, Jason and Mohanad. Thanks for having me today. It's really a pleasure to join both of you on this podcast. How did I get started in imaging? I would actually say that it actually goes back to 1992 when I was a third-year university engineering student at the University of Toronto. I was basically diagnosed with a form of cancer known as Hodgkin's lymphoma at the time. And as you might imagine, that was very transformative in how it influenced the course of the rest of my life. And what I really wanted to do was devote my life to essentially using my engineering skills in the context of medicine, which, as you might imagine, literally saved my life when I had cancer. And so I felt a great sense of gratitude for that, and I really wanted to be able to give back. And so that really set me on the path of applying engineering to medicine, and a very natural sort of application of engineering to medicine was, of course, imaging. And I always found imaging really fascinating, and how all of these images are produced and everything. And then so that is basically what set me on that path. And my career really started out working at a major teaching hospital here in Toronto, University Health Network. And I worked there for a number of years. That group produced what you mentioned earlier, which was eFilm, one of those early PACS viewers. And honestly, I think it was probably the first PACS viewer that was actually released for free. And it was, I think, the fact that it was released for free at the time was actually very critical in my formation, because it gave me an idea of what was possible. Because when you have people in all over the world downloading eFilm and using it in like field hospitals and wars and that sort of thing, it was like, wow, it's incredible what you can do, right? And I think that really sort of started the path for me for eventually moving on to ClearCanvas.
That's a good segue. So let's talk a little bit about ClearCanvas. You mentioned the global reach that having a free viewer like eFilm had. I have had the honor of getting to go to some places like Africa and Nepal, and I have seen ClearCanvas everywhere. It's so heavily used across the world. So let's talk a little bit about this. What was the origin story of starting ClearCanvas, and then why did you choose open source as opposed to closed solution?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I mean, it really sort of segues from my time at eFilm, which eventually became Merge Healthcare and everything. I had seen the impact of what a free viewer could do, and it really got me to thinking, what additional step could we take to actually make this software even more accessible? And so I started thinking, oh, what if we open sourced it as well? Not only just free binaries, but open source as well. And so that was really sort of the thinking behind ClearCanvas. The mission of the organization of ClearCanvas was from the very beginning is how do we make imaging informatics more accessible to people? I think we're all old enough to know how much PACS cost back then, and it was obviously very pricey. And I felt like, there are a lot of places in the world where they just can't afford to spend hundreds of thousands or if not millions of dollars on a system. I really felt that I wanted to use my skills to be able to bring about an organization to make more of that sort of technology as accessible to people as possible. And so that was really the thinking.
If I may interject here for a moment, I'm going to ask a question that's perhaps a little bit silly because both of you were there. But for people like me who were not there, you mentioned that eFilm was giving away a viewer for free. So I'm actually curious, what happened to that? Is that still around? Did it disappear? And what prompted you to thinking, okay, well, if this is still around, I'm still going to make my own? What made you decide this was a good idea?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think that obviously eFilm eventually became a commercial product and everything. And it was still very reasonably priced. But I think for me, even though it was available for free at one point, I really wanted to be able to see if I could go above and beyond that, right? And hence the open source angle. And I think it was really sort of the open source angle that really led me to do something beyond what eFilm did. But I think eFilm was very much sort of the inspiration, if you like, for what we ended up doing at ClearCanvas later.
Amazing. Tell us about what happened with ClearCanvas. And step by step, I don't want to miss any of the details.
Step by step. All right. Let's.
It's almost like prompting an LLM.
Yeah.
Solve this step by step.
That's right. So yeah, so the process of developing ClearCanvas was, I think, really interesting. Basically, I had started it just on my own, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed coding and everything, and so I basically sat at home for a year just writing code. And I had come from like a C++ background, and now I was going to learn C# and get into the .NET world and everything. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do with ClearCanvas was to build a system that was extensible, where you could essentially add plugins to it, and then you can sort of customize some of the functionality and everything. Again, that was really part of the larger mission of making the technology available to people, but also empowering people to make it their own as well. And so I think the combination of the open source and sort of the extensibility was very much part of the mission of the organization. I wrote that code for like a year on my couch and that sort of thing. Eventually, long story short, I mean, we were very fortunate to have gotten a contract with the major hospital where we would essentially redevelop their PACS and their risks. And that's basically how, we sort of got off the ground as a company. We, after a number of years of doing that, we kind of struck out on our own. And, we basically adopted a different sort of business model where we had, it wasn't so much a contract with the hospital, but a more of a traditional sales model and that sort of thing. So, throughout this process of making ClearCanvas available as open source was really quite something. And I don't think I really realized it at the time, just sort of what sort of impact that it was having. When you're in the middle of it, you're always trying to, add features and fix bugs and stuff like that. Oh, we got to make it better. And you're not necessarily thinking about the adoption that has been happening. But, I think there was a point in time where we were looking at the downloads, and it was like, oh my goodness. And keep in mind, this is a number of years ago too, right? So it was like tens of thousands of downloads. It's like, wow, what's going on here, right? This is crazy. We actually had a sort of a dynamically generated map of where downloads were coming from and all of the download statistics and everything. And we were looking at it, and it was being downloaded from every corner of the of the Earth, which was, we even had some downloads in Antarctica and stuff. I don't know if it was real, but that's what it said, right? And it was amazing. Like, I just couldn't believe what was happening. I think, but of course, I think like I said, when you're in the middle of it all, you're not necessarily thinking about all the numbers and everything. But I think it probably wasn't until years later, even after, ClearCanvas was acquired and everything, that I actually had a chance to sort of step back and think about it. When we got that recognition from the ACR, from the American College of Radiology, quite a seminal moment where it was like, oh my goodness, it's actually had a more of an impact than I realized.
We're going to circle back to that ACR acknowledgement. Before we get there, I just want to kind of set us with the time frame. So I believe when you started ClearCanvas, was that 2005, 2006 time period?
I left Merge around June of 2004. ClearCanvas was officially incorporated in November of 2005.
Okay. Right now, it's kind of taken for granted that there are we have a rich array of different open source programs and materials. And, Mohaned's got his Orthang t-shirt. I'm sure he's wearing underneath there. And so there's so many you can pick from. What was it like as far as the people's acceptance of why you were going down this path? Did people misunderstand open source software then versus kind of what you see today?
That's a really interesting question. I think back then, open source was, not nearly as common as it is now. I think there was also a view that open source wasn't always that serious. So there's this sense of, it's the hobby project that's going to be kind of buggy and you can't really rely on it for anything real and stuff. There was, of course, Linux, which obviously everyone did, but certainly in this space, I don't think there was a whole lot of open source packages available. And so I think when we, were first able to put out essentially professional quality software as open source, I think I imagine that it was probably a bit surprising to some people because it was like, oh, wow, this is actually a solid piece of software and you can actually use it for useful things.
When you're going on this path of open source, how clear did you have a business model in your mind? Well, I listened to this podcast recently about TiVo. TiVo is built on
That's
Linux.
Right. That's right.
Apparently, there was quite a resistance in the community that how dare you profit from this open source solution, like back in 97 when they were developing that. So talk us through kind of the business aspect of starting a company that's founded on open source.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Honestly, I'm not sure if I'm sort of the prototypical example of how to do this, but I'll tell you what happened, and you can sort of judge for yourself as to whether it's actually something that's reproducible. I think we were very fortunate that we had essentially a multi-year consulting gig, essentially, with the hospital to develop the product. The hospital, of course, was very open to keeping it open source, even though they were essentially funding it in a way. That was a decision that they made. I honestly thought that it was very forward-thinking of them and innovative of them to do that. And I think there's often the view that you shouldn't you're going to put all this hard work into it and everything, and why would you just give it away and that sort of thing. But I think when you sort of put aside some of those traditional capitalist measures and that sort of thing, I think you can definitely see that it has made an impact that, quite frankly, would not have been possible if it were not open source, to be quite honest, right? Maybe we would have made more money and that sort of thing. That's probably true, but we would definitely have had a much smaller user base. I think that in our particular case, we basically had essentially a consulting revenue model along with open source.
In your opinion, what did people misunderstand about open source at the time versus what you think people don't still understand about open source nowadays?
Yeah, I think, back then, I don't think that I don't think they necessarily saw open source back then as something serious that you could actually install in a hospital or something like that, because I think there's this sort of misunderstanding that you have an open source project and everyone is just, contributing to it willy-nilly, and how do you maintain quality and all that sort of stuff, none of which is true. Right. Obviously we were quite strict in terms of our code quality and everything, in terms of what gets committed to the repository. And so I think that what I hope we did was demonstrate that you could actually build a professional quality piece of software, but still make it open source. And those two things are orthogonal. Those are not the same thing, right? Where, code quality is not indicated by whether it's open source or closed source. I mean, you have plenty of closed source software that's written badly as well, right? And so that's kind of how I saw it.
So, Norman, you mentioned a couple of almost like moments when you realized this was getting big, like number of downloads. You had downloads from Antarctica. You never figured out why someone was downloading it from Antarctica. When you said that, I had images of, a message in a bottle, but got stuck in frozen waters. But my stupid brain aside, obviously there were probably multiple moments, not one, when you realized, okay, this is really taking off. I wouldn't say it was bigger than you imagined, because it sounds like you had a grand vision, and it sounds like you're making progress towards your grand vision. But I'm actually curious about your proudest moments over the years. And of course, leading up to the ACR award, I want to hear a lot more about that.
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer in some ways. I think in part because when you're in the midst of it, I think it's really easy to be very self-critical. You always think that, oh, you're not doing it well enough, it's not good enough, and I really feel like it wasn't until after that I really had a chance to think about the impact that it had. I think that really culminated in the ACR Global Humanitarian Award that we were nominated for, and that we were given. The award actually still sits on my desk today. I can see it right here. And yeah, I realized it actually meant more to me than I realized, because I think for many years, I felt that I had not done as good of a job as I could have. I wish I could have done better in certain ways and stuff like that. And I think when I look at the award on my desk, it is a reminder to me, I think, of the team that we had. I think we had an amazing team. We were small but mighty. These were a bunch of developers who loved what they do and were incredibly committed to just putting out a high quality piece of software. I was speaking to one of my former ClearCanvas colleagues just a couple of weeks ago. And he's gone on to do other things and worked at other companies. Interestingly, he still thinks of ClearCanvas as sort of the highlight of his career. I mean, he's been in the business for I don't know, 30 years or something like that, right? But he still looks back fondly on his days at ClearCanvas being arguably his most impactful ever. For me, I think it's just this reminder of the incredible team that we had, and what we were able to achieve with the people on that team.
You mentioned a small team, and we're framing this discussion in the mid-aughts. And so if we were to fast forward to today, we have Claude Code, Codex. There's so many opportunities. Actually, I was having a conversation with Chris Hafey about his endeavor,
Yep.
And he was talking about, I think he has 5 developers, and they can do the work of, however many, because of the strength of these AI tools. Where do you see, or what would you imagine as being different today? Would you have a smaller footprint on the team? How would you envision that a ClearCanvas version 2 would exist in the age of AI?
Oh my goodness. That's a huge question. I mean, we can talk a little later about what I'm doing now, but certainly having experienced what AI tools like Claude Code can actually do, it is extraordinary how much you can produce if you set things up well. I think that if if we were to do ClearCanvas a second time with all of the tools right now, I think we could ship something pretty good in a relatively short period of time, and probably better than what we actually did ship. I do think though that a lot of what we did at ClearCanvas was very much a product of a lot of conversations, though, right? And I think that's really important. Conversations with each other, conversations with users. And so while we would be able to do the actual coding part a lot faster now, I think it's important not to forget that, that coding part is only enabled by the fact that we've amassed and accumulated all of this domain experience that you don't necessarily get right away when you sit down at Claude Code unless you know exactly what questions to ask it and stuff, right? So I think while I do think the productivity multiplier is huge, I think it's also important to not forget the uniquely human contributions that have been made to prompt the AI in such a way that it actually gives you what you want.
Yeah, I think that there's a big underestimation of the value of the human still.
Yeah.
As we see a lot of companies laying people off en masse. Actually, I'm interested in your thoughts and maybe this can kind of get into, we'll explore more about what you're doing specifically, but as you're building this out, are you using AI today? And I'm curious to hear about how you're doing your own personal code reviews if you are.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I am absolutely using all of those AI tools today. I've used a number of them. I started out using just a sort of a very niche one for the particular technology stack that I was building on. I eventually moved to Codex from OpenAI, and then tried out Google's anti-gravity. And now I'm using Claude Code, and now I probably can't go back from that now because it is the experience has been really, really phenomenal. I think that in terms of code review and that sort of thing, I still very insistent on reviewing the code before I commit it to the repo. I don't necessarily review every single line, but it is extremely important to me that the architecture is set up well when when I am reviewing a set of code changes. Because honestly, there have been times when, I've asked it to do something and it's gone and done it in a way that is like, nah, not quite right there. Let's try again. You do have to apply the appropriate guardrails, obviously, when you are using AI to code. You need to, not everyone does this, but I still like to read it just because I kind of like the coding process still. And so I do insist on reading it and reviewing it and make sure it makes sense. And, you often have to keep it on somewhat of a short leash so that it doesn't go sort of awry and astray. But I will say that I think if you have set up the architectural patterns well in your code base, it makes it a lot easier for the AI to actually follow them and to respect the patterns that you have set up ahead of time. It prevents it from sort of going off and doing its own thing and writing all this weird inline code that you really don't want, whereas you could reuse all of these other pieces of code that already exist and stuff, right? So, in my Claude.md file, I always say, okay, make sure that, you're looking to these different places for repeatable patterns so that it'll actually make use of those and it won't sort of start repeating itself and that sort of thing unnecessarily, and leveraging components that already exist and patterns that already exist.
I just want to weigh in and say that I agree with everything you said there. My personal experience, I don't write code full-time anymore, but I occasionally have to jump in and prototype something and try and solve problems. I love AI. It's definitely made me more efficient. I can crank out stuff faster. But just like you, I definitely insist on reviewing the code because I occasionally catch it. Yes, it can build me something relatively comprehensive, but I'll still make a really silly mistake every now and then. Even, using a paid model like Claude or, OpenAI models. Recently, I had a funny one where I was performing an OAuth authentication workflow. So it obtained the access token, and then it wants to embed in subsequent calls, but it's sending it as a get parameter, which like even a junior developer knows about.
Right.
That's always sent as a header. It's never sent as a get parameter. That's a no-go. Not a couple of months ago, a few months ago, I was actually looking at like, let me see how far I could take this AI thing. So I was looking at the IHE IRA profile, the AI results assessment. And I was thinking this is going to be a fun experiment. So basically what the profile is what happens when you accept, reject, modify AI results. So there's one SR I have, which is the original AI results, and there's the updated SR, which has got the modified results. So without giving it any context, I just threw it into ChatGPT, cranked up all the settings like maximum thinking time, highest model. Give me your best, your absolute best. I told it, write me Python code that takes in this SR and spits out this SR. It spun for 25 minutes. 25 minutes. And it gave me code that was complete hallucination. Absolute hallucination. Like zero value.
Wow.
Yeah. In the Python scheme, you usually are going to use something like PyDICOM to parse the file and generate the other one. But I think in this case, it actually even hallucinated to the point where it like used a weird mixture of Python, PyDICOM, but then like assumed that some of the objects were JSON objects instead of DICOM. So like, again, this was a few months ago, so I don't remember the full thing, but I just remember like when it spot out the code and I started reading, I almost fell off my chair. Yep. So yes, definitely have to read the code for sure.
So maybe this is a good time. We know that you're using AI as a tool to help you build something. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about CareChorus.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the story of CareChorus actually started. One was a couple of relevant stories. The first one was a friend and former colleague had given me a call and let me know that her husband had a pretty serious diagnosis. And one of the things that I had said that might be a good idea is just to make sure all of your medical records and everything are sort of in order, right? Get them into a binder, sort them in, chronological order so that the next specialist that you see can easily sort through it to do their consult. After I got off the phone with her, I thought, why are we still using paper? This is ridiculous. At the time it was like, 2024 or something. And it's like, wow, we should not have to do this by hand. So that was the first story. The second story was another friend and former colleague. He was diagnosed with a very serious form of cancer. And he was telling me about his experience of the healthcare system, which was often that the left hand didn't always know what the right hand was doing. And I think we've all seen that before, right? And, he told me all of the things that had happened and everything. And that really got me to thinking about, can we do better? I don't think that technology can solve every problem. I mean, there are many problems that are fundamentally systemic or political or whatever they are, but I think that technology can help. And so his story, I think, was also very formative. Unfortunately, he did end up passing away a number of months after his diagnosis. But I think those two stories, really set the foundation for what I wanted to do. And so I really started thinking about, how am I going to do something maybe with technology that might be helpful in these types of situations, right? And so that was really sort of the initial thinking behind CareChorus. And so, the company that I was working for last year, around this time, I had left to essentially start CareChorus, and that's basically what I've been doing since. In terms of what CareChorus is, so the problems that I'm really trying to solve are essentially fourfold. One is essentially a clerical or administrative problem, which is the whole idea that whenever we have an encounter with the healthcare system, there's tons of paper, either physical paper or digital paper, all of these records and everything. And it's hard to sort of keep track of all of them and sort through all of them and honestly to keep them all in one place. Obviously, you go to different institutions, you got to log into different portals and all this sort of stuff, and it's hard to keep track of it all. One of the problems that I really wanted to be able to solve was to essentially organize all of this stuff, all of these artifacts that are generated when we encounter the healthcare system, to store them in one place, to be able to organize them in a logical sort of way. I kind of call that sort of the fancy filing cabinet, but I think we all know that fancy filing cabinets are really not that interesting, right? Years ago, I think we saw this with I think Google Health and Microsoft Health Vault and that sort of thing. Where we say, hey, you can store all your stuff in the cloud and all this sort of stuff. And those projects ended up sort of dying and going away, right? And my hypothesis as to why they went away was that they didn't answer sort of the fundamental question of what is the fancy filing cabinet for? Right? What is the purpose of the fancy filing cabinet? And so this really sort of gets into some of the other problems that I'm also aiming to solve. So the second problem is just this problem of not understanding the stuff that you get out of the system, right? You get a radiology report. I mean, we've been sort of in this radiology adjacent space for, how many years, but I'm going to bet that, if we had some sort of radiology report written by a radiologist for other physicians, we're going to look at this and it's like half the stuff, I don't know what this means. And so I think I wanted to be able to essentially bridge that understanding gap, right? Because I think having understanding of your records is critical to essentially being able to talk to other people and advocating for yourself. And that really relates to sort of the two other problems. So one is, a lot of the time, if we happen to be in a healthcare adjacent space, or we have friends who are doctors and that sort of thing, we can often go and say, we WhatsApp them and say, hey, I got this result. Can you tell me what it means? What should I do? And that sort of thing. But I think the fact that, we know people in the biz and that sort of thing it's a privilege. And the reality is that a lot of people do not know people in the biz and who have connections and that sort of thing. So I was kind of thinking, how might we be able to make it so that people can still have access to some of this information without necessarily having all these connections. Final thing is really this idea of patient empowerment, and patient advocacy. I think we've seen time and time again that when a patient is well involved in their own care and is knowledgeable about their own care, the outcomes are better. And so ultimately, that's what we want to do, right? The ultimate why, for the fancy filing cabinet is to get better outcomes. Right. And then there's a whole chain of potential events and sort of understandings and whatnot that can lead you from the fancy filing cabinet to the better result. So that's really what CareChorus is about. I will say that, are there other products that do similar things? Yeah, sure. Right. Absolutely. I think that, a couple of the distinctive factors about CareChorus are, one, we focus not just on the patient, but also on the caregivers as well. Because a lot of time, maybe you are an adult who is caring for an elderly parent, or you're a parent who's caring for ill children. You want to be able to manage all of that sort of stuff in one place, right? And you want to be able to not just be focused on your own health, but the health of others. The second distinctive, I think, is also that when it comes to, especially living in where we live here in Ontario and in Canada, I mean, there are a lot of people who don't necessarily speak English as their first language. And if you can create a product that will actually help them understand, even despite that language barrier, I think that would obviously be very helpful. And so those are the couple of the distinctive angles that we're taking on the product.
So maybe this is not the smartest question to follow up with, given your history, but I know in a private conversation, you told us that CareChorus is a nonprofit. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I've been asked this question many times, and I think people look at me with some degree of puzzlement. So why would you do that? It's so weird. I think that having run ClearCanvas, which was a normal for-profit sort of business, one of the things that I learned about myself is that I don't think I'm the right kind of person to lead a for-profit organization. I just don't think that's me. And it's taken me many years to sort of come to that realization. And I kind of figured, I'm old enough now that, what, I don't care what people say. I'm just going to do what I think is right. And so I'm just going to do it in the way that I think it should be done. And so basically, I felt like that the nonprofit shape of the organization was much more well suited to me and my personality and what I do well and also what I don't do well. The second reason I think is more strategic and intentional, which is I think that for an app like this, which I'm building, I think the trust signal is really important, that you be able to signal to people, hey, there's this app out there, I'm going to put stuff in it, and you can be confident that, I'm not going to take it and sell your data and all this sort of stuff. I mean, I'm not going to do all these nefarious things with it. I think when it is a nonprofit, I think that sends a signal to users that, you should be able to trust this organization. And so I think that's more on the strategic side of things. I think really related to that, I think, is really just our position on when it comes to privacy and that sort of thing. All of the data that you put on it is stored locally on your device. You don't store it in my cloud or anything like that. I don't see any of your data. If you want to back it up or share it with other people, you use your own Google Drive account to do that and that sort of thing. So you have full control. It's kind of why I decided to go the nonprofit route. I think it was basically just, it fits me better. And I think it just sends a more positive trust signal to people who are going to use it.
I think that's a good signal where when what you said is sometimes you're not the best person to lead a for-profit organization. I think sometimes, as we've seen and with many organizations, that seems to be sometimes the only driving force is for-profit. Yes. And we lose sight of the actual vision of whatever we're setting out to do.
It's absolutely true, right? Like, I mean, I think that, I have no problem with for-profit organizations, obviously. People have to make a living and stuff like that. I get it, right? But I think that there are sometimes instances when the mission of an organization is not always fully amenable to a for-profit sort of model, right? And so I think this could be one of those instances. Does it mean that we don't have to generate revenue? No, we still have to generate revenue, just to be clear. But I think the motivation, I think, is going to be different.
And for what it's worth, I'll add this for the benefit of our listeners. I've gotten a private demo that Norm was kind enough to give me previously. So as someone who matches the criteria he mentioned, I'm an adult who cares for both my elderly parents and for my children. Healthy, but, occasionally things happen. I think it's brilliant. And Norm, I cannot wait for this to come out because I could see myself using this right on day one.
Amazing.
So I'm not plugging any products here, but I will just tell the listeners, go to CareChorus.ca, scroll down to the bottom. There's an option to join the mailing list. Please do. You're going to love it.
Thank you, Mohammed. Really appreciate those words.
With all that said, Norm, would you like to give any closeout thoughts before we wrap up here?
I'll end on something a little not technical, something a little bit more philosophical. I'm 54 years old now, so I'm getting a little older. One of the things that I realized was, I may have, if I retire at 65 or whatever it is, I got 10, 12 years left or whatever it is to make the most of my sort of professional career and that sort of thing. And I really wanted to make these remaining years count. I really wanted to make as positive and as large an impact as possible. I feel that I've been given just a wealth of experiences and knowledge, whatever it might be. I feel like it would be wrong of me to not do something with all of that. Want to make the most of my remaining professional years. And I would encourage all of your listeners as well to think in those terms, in terms of, looking back on the impact that you've already had, especially if you're a little further on in your career, and just thinking about what can I do with all of these experiences to continue to make a lasting impact on people, and to really make a difference that will outlast you. So I would end on that.
It's a great way to end it. Thank you very much, Norm. Really appreciate this.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. This was brilliant. I appreciate it.
The Dream Machine. DICOM, HL7, IHE, and Snap. We're building the future, never looking back.